My name's Vicki Bruce. I am the publisher and producer of the Arundel Patriot, one of the producers. And I am here visiting a friend, and it inspired me to start a new series for the Arundel Patriot. And I think one of the things that we're all missing most these days is the contact with our parents and grandparents. And it's so nice to be here and see my friend, and I'm keeping distance from him, and we're keeping safe. But one of the things I miss most about being in this pandemic and being in the quarantine are the times that we spend talking to people with these wonderful stories, and those are our grandparents. So I thought we need to start a series called Grandpa Stories and Grandma Stories. So this is going to be your first episode in the premiere, and anybody who has a grandma or grandpa or dad or mom who would like to be part of Grandpa or Grandma Stories, reach out to the Arundel Patriot at editor@arundelpatriot.org. We're also a nonprofit. Please subscribe to us by going to our website. You can be a patron, and we can keep bringing you great entertainment and news. So without further ado, this is our first grandpa for Grandpa Stories. This is my dear, dear friend, Jack Blum. And Jack, you are up.
Thank you, Vicki. The story I'm going to tell you is about going to the Caymen Islands, a place in the Caribbean, which became notorious for laundering drug money, but also helping people cheat on their taxes. And I had been working on the things that were going on in the Caymans for a while, first while I was working for the Senate, and then in private practice when I had a client who was in the Cayman Islands who really wanted things to improve. He didn't like the whole business of drug trafficking and money laundering there, and he thought it would be a good idea to have me help him expose what was happening. So one day he called me and he said, "There's a terrible bank here, and you might want to figure out how to do something about this bank." I began to talk to a couple of journalist friends, including a producer for BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And the producer had the idea of giving me a briefcase that had a concealed camera, and perhaps I would walk in to the banker and tell him, who didn't like paying tax at all, and ask him if he could help. So we went in, and the way I connected with the banker, of course, he asked, "How did you get my name?" I said, "You had a full-page ad advertising your services in the Cayman Islands Airline magazine, so I thought it would be okay to talk to you."
What year was this, Jack?
1994, probably 1993. The program later aired in 94. But after an initial conversation, he invited me to his office, and I arrived carrying the briefcase. And he went into this explanation of how to hide money offshore from the tax people. And he said, "What you do is you write a check to a company that I'll tell you to write the check for, and we'll give you a receipt for the check that shows it's for buying some goods or something to help in your business. And then we'll put the money in our bank account in the Cayman Islands. But that account can be in any name you want it to be in, corporation we set up, you name what you want on that bank account, but it doesn't have to be your name. We don't need social security numbers. We don't need anything." So I said, "Well, what do I do if I want the money? You know, it's nice that I'm sending you this money and you're opening an account, but it's not going to be in my name, so I've got to trust you, and then I've got to figure out how do I get the money back." Well, he said, "No problem at all. We give you a debit card, and you can put as much of the money on the debit card as you'd like to have, and the debit card can have any name you want on it. And then all you have to do is put it in an ATM in the US and pull out the cash as you need it. I said, okay, that sounds pretty good. But what happens if I really need a lot of money? Well, he said, we have a solution for that problem too. We have an arrangement with a bank in the Channel Islands. That would be a British possession that's off the coast of France. And that bank will be happy to put a mortgage on your house, on your business property. And that mortgage will be a mortgage that, in effect, you own. You're putting a mortgage on your own property. And when you pay the monthlies on that mortgage, you'll be able to deduct the interest you're paying yourself. And of course, no questions asked, because after all, it's your own money. And there's no trace back to our bank in the Cayman Islands, because this is through another bank that has no obvious connection to us. So I get all of this down on the tape in my briefcase, and then we begin a process of editing the tape and later putting it together for broadcast on both BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, and on PBS, public television in the US. Well, when this thing aired, it created quite a stink, because the man who owned the bank, Mr. Mathewson, was already pretty much of a cagey character who people really didn't like having in the Cayman Islands, because he had come there with a reputation as having worked for some mobsters in Chicago, and he owed the American Internal Revenue Service more than $12 million. And at one point, he had traveled to Miami. He's an American citizen, so no problem getting into the country. But he traveled to Miami, and IRS people found out that he was going to Miami. And they got a writ from a court, a federal court in Miami, which has a wonderful Latin name, Ne Exiat Republica. You can't get out of the country, is what a loose translation of that would be. And it's you can't get out of the country till you pay the $12 million. Well, they got the writ, but it didn't last long. Another judge looked at it and said, nah, if he wants to go, he can go. And he went back to the Caymans. But the people in Cayman didn't like having a guy like that own a bank in the middle of their island. Well, when this thing aired, the pressure on him got really intense. And finally, the bank regulator in Cayman began to look into what was going on at the bank. And it turned out that most of the bank's business was much like exactly what he had offered to do for me. So they decided to pull his bank license and throw him off the island. Well, next thing I heard about all of this was that he was trying to get a banking license in the Bahamas to pick up and do the same thing all over again. And when I was tipped off about that through a friend, I contacted the editor of a leading newspaper in the Bahamas, who ran a story about Mr. Mathewson and how he was trying to get a bank license because he'd been thrown out of the Cayman Islands and would like to move his business over to the Bahamas. And when that happened, the Bahamian authorities said, nah, we really don't like this. We don't want this guy around. So he got pretty well tossed out of the Bahamas as well. Now, would this make any difference? Well, to an extent it made some difference, because people became more aware of what was going on. And as I recall, the BBC people actually interviewed Margaret Thatcher about this whole Cayman Islands exercise. And that's because, after all, the Cayman Islands are a territory of the UK, and therefore the responsibility of the British. And she was not pleased by being interviewed about it. Later, when the same producer had the idea of doing the same thing in the British Virgin Islands, which is another Caribbean possession of the Brits, they went there to explore the possibility of doing an undercover taping, and they weren't allowed to get off the airplane, which is pretty remarkable because almost anybody can get off the airplane there. But when the British Virgin Islands government people found out what they were up to, they said, no, we don't need that kind of publicity, and that was the end of that. They wanted people to focus either on the beach or on doing really dirty business, which was what they did a lot of at the time. But it was interesting. After that was over, I went back a couple of years later. I went back to the island, and at the time I got to know the guy who was the British governor. The way it works is the British Foreign Office appoints a governor who becomes the Queen's representative on the island. And what he gets for it is a house on 7 Mile Beach, and not a bad life. But he threw a party, and I was invited to the party. And at the party, a guy comes up and says, I know you, you're the movie star. And all I could do was laugh. I was pretty happy to get out of there in one piece.
So in those days when people were hiding money offshore, and you're an offshore expert, how did you get your money offshore?
Well, the way you got the money out of the country was you wrote a check to whatever corporation the banker told you to do it for, and that corporation was a U.S. corporation and a U.S. bank. And the money simply moved out of the country and looked like a normal business deal. You're simply sending money to a foreign bank, and you have paid a domestic check to a domestic bank. And they'll cheerfully give you an invoice that shows that you bought something. So there was another similar case that I got involved in where the guy had set up, he owned a family business, and the family business they had a factory, and he was siphoning money off and moving it out of the country. So what he did was he had a bank in the Bahamas. The Bank of the Bahamas would make up invoices for non-existent machinery. So he'd write out to Island Merchants Limited, one injection molding machine, $15,000. He'd write the $15,000 check, but the machine never came because there was no machine. And anytime he wanted to move money out, they'd simply make up another invoice. And of course, nobody ever checks to make sure that the machinery is there or that it in fact exists, or, and he's writing it off as a business expense. So that's how people get the money out of the country. And every once in a while they get caught, and when they get caught, it's pretty nasty. The guy I was just talking about wound up with a tax bill of about $55 million.
Well, thank you, Jack, this is the first episode of Grandpa Stories. Grandma stories are welcome too. So people out there, if you have a mother, father, grandma, and grandpa who has a fun story who'd like to be on the Arundel Patriot, hit us up. We'd love to hear from you. Let's archive all these great stories while we have our seniors
Thank you.